On the morning of October 4th, 2010, it was just another ordinary Saturday in the quiet town of Huron Ridge, Ohio. The kind of town where everyone still left their porch lights on for no real reason, where neighbors waved across driveways, and where crimes, when they happened, felt like distant intrusions from somewhere else. At 9:12 a.m., 39-year-old Angela Brierly stepped out of her front door with her car keys in one hand and her pharmacy rewards card in the other. Her kids, Evan, age 12, and Riley, just 6, were still in their pajamas finishing breakfast. She told them she'd be right back, just picking up a prescription refill and maybe a pack of gum for Riley. They expected her back before the cereal bowls went cold. Angela had no known enemies, no ongoing disputes, no secret affairs. She worked part-time at a daycare center, volunteered at her church, and had a predictable routine. Saturdays were always simple: chores, errands, and dinner with her sister's family. That day, she left behind a full list on the fridge right next to Riley's magnet art. When her husband, Mark Brierly, got home from his overnight shift as a warehouse supervisor around noon, he wasn't concerned at first. Maybe the line at the pharmacy was long. Maybe she swung by the grocery store. Maybe her phone had died. Theories that made sense for a while. But by 1:30, Angela hadn't returned a single call or text. By 2:15, her phone went straight to voicemail. Mark called the pharmacy, then the grocery store, then Angela's sister. No one had seen her. By 3 p.m., he was driving the route she usually took. He passed the pharmacy twice, walked through the parking lot. Nothing looked unusual. Her silver Toyota Corolla was nowhere in sight. By 4:30, Mark called the police. The initial report didn't set off alarms. Adults disappear all the time, and most of the time they return. Officers noted the facts, asked if there had been any recent arguments, any medication changes, any reason Angela might have wanted to step away from her life. Mark insisted there was none. The officers filed the report, marked it as low risk, and told him to call back if she wasn't home by the next morning. That night, Mark barely slept. He kept the porch light on, just in case she pulled into the driveway. Evan sat on the couch staring at the door. Riley kept asking if they could wait outside. When Angela still hadn't come back by sunrise, Mark called the station again. That's when it shifted. Patrol cars were dispatched. A bolo, be on the lookout, was issued for her vehicle. Angela's photo was circulated, first among local departments, then to state agencies. She was officially listed as a missing person. By Sunday afternoon, detectives were knocking on neighbors' doors. Did anyone see her leave that morning? Had anyone noticed her car later that day? A few vague sightings came in, all unconfirmed. One neighbor thought they saw her turning onto 5th Street around 9:30 a.m., but couldn't be sure. Another mentioned a silver sedan parked near the alley behind the post office, but by the time officers checked, it was gone. Angela's family began organizing flyers that same evening. Mark printed 100 copies at a gas station printer and passed them out at every gas pump, bus stop, and strip mall within 5 miles. Her sister Debbie posted on local Facebook groups while volunteers stapled posters to telephone poles. Missing mother of 2, last seen wearing. Navy hoodie, jeans, and white sneakers. It hit the local news on Monday morning. Police reviewed traffic cams but found little. The pharmacy security footage confirmed she pulled into the lot at 9:24 a.m., parked in a spot near the side entrance, and got out of the car. She entered the building, but there was no footage of her exiting. The system had blind spots due to remodeling. Areas near the dumpsters and employee exits weren't covered. Investigators questioned pharmacy staff. One clerk remembered seeing her waiting in line. Another said Angela picked up her prescription and left. No one remembered seeing her after that. The pharmacy's back door led to a side alley, usually used by employees or delivery vans. Police scoured it. No blood, no drag marks, no broken jewelry. Just a few tire marks, a broken pallet, and oil stains. The dumpster was emptied the morning before. Nothing. By Wednesday, the local news ran a full segment. The words, "vanished without a trace," echoed across the county. A volunteer search party combed through nearby fields and wooded areas. Nothing. Dogs were brought in. They picked up her scent inside the pharmacy but lost it outside the side exit. Authorities drained a nearby retention pond just in case. Still nothing. Mark was questioned again. That's routine in these cases, especially when no immediate answers surface. He cooperated fully, handed over his phone, submitted to a polygraph, his alibi, a time-stamped warehouse check-in verified by co-workers and security logs, held up. There was no life insurance motive, no unusual bank activity, no signs of domestic strain. Angela's digital footprint showed no secret social media accounts, no suspicious communications. Her life, on paper, was completely normal, but nothing about her disappearance was. Within 10 days, the case went from strange to disturbing. Theories circulated, both online and in whispers through the neighborhood. Maybe she was abducted by someone she knew. Maybe it was random. Maybe it was something else entirely. No ransom calls ever came. Her debit card was never used again. Her phone remained dark. And the most haunting part? There was no goodbye. No note. No signal. One moment she was there. The next, she was simply gone. A mother steps out for a quick errand, leaving behind 2 kids and a husband, and doesn't come back. No one thought it would stay unsolved for long, but that was only the beginning. By the second week of Angela Brierly's disappearance, the investigation had shifted from hopeful to quietly desperate. What began as a missing person report now felt like something darker, something harder to define. The initial belief that maybe she got into a stranger's car willingly or had simply wandered off in some kind of disoriented state no longer held weight. Too much time had passed, and now detectives had something tangible. On October 13th, 9 days after she vanished, Angela's Toyota Corolla was located 2.5 miles from the pharmacy, parked on a cracked, uneven patch of pavement behind a shuttered dental office on the edge of an industrial strip. The area was rarely used, partially fenced off and largely invisible from the road. The car was unlocked. Her purse was still on the passenger seat, wallet inside. ID untouched, no money missing, the keys were gone. So was her phone. The driver's seat had been pushed slightly further back than usual, according to Mark. But the police couldn't confirm if it had been adjusted post-disappearance. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the vehicle, just a layer of dust beginning to settle on the windshield. A receipt from the pharmacy time-stamped 9:48 a.m. sat crumpled in the console. She'd picked up her prescription and vanished sometime shortly after. Investigators secured the car and brought in a forensic team. They swabbed every surface for prints, DNA, fibers. Most of what they found belonged to Angela. A few latent prints were inconclusive. They found a partial smudge on the rear driver's side door handle that didn't match her. It was degraded, likely too old or partial to identify. No hair strands, no blood spatter, no fingerprints on the steering wheel that didn't belong. It was like the car had been dropped off by a ghost. Officers canvassed the surrounding buildings, a few vacant offices, a welding shop, and a Chinese takeout place with security cameras pointed inward. None of the businesses had seen anything. No one remembered a silver Corolla appearing. No surveillance footage from that weekend showed the vehicle arriving. Investigators believed the car was likely dropped off after dark, possibly days after she went missing. Detectives turned back to the pharmacy for answers. They reviewed the internal footage again, frame by frame. Angela enters through the side door at 9:26 a.m., stands in line, chats briefly with the pharmacist, collects her medication, and leaves frame at 9:47. She's holding a white plastic pharmacy bag and her phone in her left hand. Then, she's gone. The cameras at the main entrance would have picked her up again if she exited the same way, but they never did. The pharmacy's rear entrance, typically used by employees and delivery drivers, had no coverage due to an ongoing system upgrade. That gap became the focus, the blind spot. They checked the back alley again. Dumpster, delivery ramp, service door, broken light overhead. This time, they brought cadaver dogs. The dogs showed mild interest in a patch near the dumpsters, but nothing conclusive. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no evidence that she had been harmed there. But she didn't exit through the front. That much was certain. Detectives began examining the pharmacy staff. No one stood out immediately. Background checks were run. No major red flags. One employee, a part-time stock clerk, had a record for trespassing and minor theft years earlier, but nothing violent. He'd clocked out the night before Angela's visit and hadn't been on shift that morning. Another employee had called out sick that day. They were questioned. Their alibis held. The lack of evidence became its own kind of evidence. It told them that if someone had taken her, they had done so quietly, without panic or mess. It suggested familiarity. Someone who knew the gaps in the camera coverage, someone who knew how to guide a person to the back exit without causing alarm. But without witnesses, without audio, without a trail, everything was speculation. There was no proof Angela had ever left that building. Flyers continued to go up, this time with new information. Vehicle found. Still missing. A tip line was opened. Calls poured in. Most were dead ends. A woman in Columbus thought she'd seen her at a gas station, but it was someone else. A man in Kentucky claimed she'd run away with a truck driver. No evidence. A caller claimed to be holding her for ransom, but it turned out to be a hoax. Each lead raised hopes and then crushed them. The community began to feel the weight of the silence. At first, they'd rallied around the Brierly family, offering meals, search assistance, comfort. But as days turned into weeks, that support thinned. People didn't know what to say anymore. Whispers began. Rumors. Maybe she wanted to disappear. Maybe there was a secret relationship. Maybe she cracked under pressure. None of it fit, but people wanted something to hold on to. Some version of the story that ended in answers, even if it didn't make sense. Mark kept pushing for updates. He called the detective in charge every morning. He organized another search of the area where the car had been found, this time with volunteers and a drone. Nothing turned up. No phone, no bag, no trace of her ever walking away from that car, no trace of how it got there. It was as if someone had driven it into a dead zone, wiped it clean, and walked away. The media story began to fade. A new headline, a triple homicide in another county, took over the front page. Angela's face moved from primetime coverage to a small photo on the local station's sidebar. But inside the Brierly home, time had stopped. Her toothbrush remained in the cup. Her favorite mug still sat beside the sink. Her clothes were untouched. Riley started sleeping in Angela's bed. Evan stopped going to soccer practice. Mark pulled away from friends. There was no closure, just a hole. 13 days after Angela vanished, the lead detective filed an internal memo. It stated that, barring new evidence or a credible witness, there was nothing further to pursue. She had walked into a pharmacy and never walked back out. Her car reappeared in a place it shouldn't have been, and the story had stalled. But some cases don't go cold because the evidence fades. Some go cold because the moment of truth was hidden too well or happened too fast. And in this case, the only thing left was the question: how does someone vanish in daylight on a routine errand with no one seeing a thing? By the third week of Angela's disappearance, the waiting had turned into something else entirely. No longer just anxiety or confusion, it had become a kind of exhaustion that soaked into every part of the family's life. The air in the Brierly home felt thinner. The house was quiet in the wrong way. Doors didn't open and close as often. Conversations slowed. The phone still rang, but now it was mostly reporters or well-meaning strangers offering psychic visions and vague dreams. Nothing useful, nothing real. Each call that wasn't her deepened the absence. Mark Brierly became the center of attention in more ways than one. He had been the last person to see her at home. He had reported her missing. He had helped search, answered every question, opened his home and his life to detectives. But that's how it always begins, isn't it? The statistics weren't in his favor. In disappearances involving women, the spouse is usually the one who knows more than they say. Investigators returned to him often, not just the local officers now, but county detectives and a behavioral analyst from Columbus. They were polite at first, then persistent. They asked about financial trouble, about stress in the marriage, about old fights. They asked if Angela had ever threatened to leave. They wanted to know if she'd been depressed. Mark answered everything with the same exhausted calm, repeating the same timeline over and over, even as their tone began to change. He consented to a second polygraph. He submitted to a forensic sweep of the house. Nothing changed. No blood, no fibers, no inconsistencies. But the questions didn't stop. Family members weren't exempt. Angela's sister Debbie was interviewed multiple times. She told detectives that Angela had never mentioned marital trouble, never hinted at wanting to escape her life. She was tired, yes, raising kids, working part-time, trying to stretch paychecks, but nothing beyond what most people endured. Angela's mother, living 2 counties away, was questioned about the early years of the marriage. She said Mark was quiet, maybe too quiet, but not dangerous. Angela's best friend from high school described him as emotionally distant, not unkind, but hard to read. None of it pointed anywhere conclusive. Even the kids weren't left alone. Evan, now 13, was asked to recount the morning his mom left. He said she seemed normal, smiled, told him to brush his teeth, promised she'd bring back a Kit Kat if he finished his chores. Riley, still too young to fully grasp the police visits, kept drawing pictures of his mom in different places, at a beach, in the clouds, standing near a mountain. The drawings piled up in the living room until Mark quietly moved them into a box. The town, once unified in concern, began to fracture too. Rumors surfaced. One neighbor said they heard yelling from the Brierly house the night before she vanished. Another claimed to have seen Mark driving at odd hours during the first few nights after. A woman who used to work with Angela at the daycare hinted that Angela had been unhappy for a while, but admitted it was more of a feeling than anything she'd actually said. The local news ran segments that danced around these uncertainties, often including the phrase, "persons of interest have not been ruled out." It didn't matter that Mark had an airtight alibi. Public opinion didn't wait for courtrooms. The pressure began to show. Mark started losing weight rapidly. He stopped shaving. He kept his phone on at all times, but answered less. He left the porch light on 24 hours a day, claiming it was for Angela in case she ever found her way back, but it began to feel more like a memorial. He stopped going to work after his manager said it was probably best to take a leave of absence. The fridge was half empty. The laundry piled up. Family meals became frozen dinners or skipped entirely. Evan withdrew into video games in silence. Riley asked less and less about where Mommy went. The police presence faded too. Detectives still took calls but made fewer visits. Tips had slowed to a trickle, and every new report seemed to be either a misunderstanding or malicious attention-seeking. One man came forward, claiming to have seen Angela in a hotel outside Dayton, but hotel staff confirmed it wasn't her. Another said she resembled a woman living in a group shelter in Illinois, but that woman had full ID and no connection to Ohio. Every false lead chipped away at the family's hope. Every dead end deepened the hollow. By the 6-week mark, Mark stopped attending the weekly search parties. He said they were useless. He said he couldn't keep pretending to find footprints in the mud that had already been walked a dozen times before. Debbie accused him of giving up. Mark snapped back that she hadn't lost a wife. They didn't speak again for nearly a month. Thanksgiving came and went. No family dinner, no photos, just 3 place settings and 1 chair that stayed empty. Christmas decorations stayed boxed in the attic. Evan asked if they could skip gifts this year. Riley didn't. He still made a list, but only asked for one thing. By New Year's, the local news cycle had fully moved on. Another crime, another fire, another family in the headlines. Angela's case was now just a picture on the sheriff's department website and a folder marked inactive, not closed, not solved, just shelved, waiting for a break that might never come. And inside the Brierly home, the absence had become the atmosphere. No one cried as loudly anymore. The grief had settled into a quieter shape, one made of empty rooms, closed doors, unanswered questions. They were still a family, but no longer the same one. Suspicion had touched everything. And as Mark stared at the porch light one night in January, still burning into the frost-covered dark, he said it out loud for the first time. What if she hadn't left willingly? What if someone had planned this? And what if that person had been closer than they'd ever imagined? By spring of the following year, the case file on Angela Brierly had grown to over 200 pages, and not a single one brought her family any closer to an answer. The Huron Ridge Police Department assigned 2 detectives full-time to the case during the first 6 months, but as time wore on, other priorities slowly pulled resources away. Still, the leads kept coming, some promising on paper, others strange and clearly rooted in desperation. Each one raised a flicker of hope, only to be swallowed again by silence. The first major theory detectives leaned into was abduction. The abrupt nature of her disappearance, the discovery of her car days later, and the lack of a digital or financial footprint all suggested someone had taken her. But taken her where and why remained impossible to answer. No witnesses reported screams. No security footage showed suspicious individuals trailing her. The pharmacy staff were interviewed again. Nothing new emerged. Detectives expanded the scope, checking registered sex offenders in the area, reviewing cases of recently released offenders, even combing through employment records at the pharmacy for anyone with a history of violence. It led to dozens of interviews and background checks. Nothing stuck. Then came the theory that she had left on her own, that maybe, despite everything the family insisted, she had reached some breaking point no one noticed. One investigator latched onto a small piece of data. 3 months before she vanished, Angela had withdrawn $800 in cash. No one could say what it was for. She hadn't made a major purchase. There was no record of a trip. It wasn't a massive sum, but in a case this cold, any anomaly stood out. Her sister said it was likely for home repairs. Mark thought it had to do with a vet bill for the family dog. The money was never deposited back or traced to a transaction. Eventually, investigators shelved it as inconclusive. Reporters didn't wait for clarity. Angela's face became a fixture on local news panels, not just as a victim, but as a mystery that fed ratings. One segment brought on a former FBI profiler who speculated, live on air, that Angela's disappearance fit the behavioral profile of a woman choosing to vanish. The word vanish was emphasized, replayed in sound bites, and repeated by strangers in grocery store checkout lines. The family was devastated. Mark called the station, left voicemails. No corrections were ever issued. 2 months after the 1-year anniversary, a tip came from Michigan. A woman in Detroit claimed she'd seen someone matching Angela's description working at a diner off at 94 under a different name. She even provided a license plate. Detectives followed up. The woman was real, but she wasn't Angela. She had lived in Michigan her whole life and provided proof within 10 minutes of questioning. Another dead end. There was also the man who walked into a police station in Illinois and claimed responsibility. He said he'd kidnapped a woman from Ohio, held her in a storage container, then dumped her body in a ravine. The story made national news for 72 hours, but the details didn't add up. He couldn't describe Angela's car. He got the date wrong. Forensics at his alleged crime scene revealed nothing. It turned out he had confessed to 6 other murders in the past, none of which were real. He was mentally unstable and had a long record of false reports. Still, for 3 days, Angela's family had to sit through the possibility that their worst fears had been confirmed. Then, just as quickly, it unraveled. Leads poured in from online communities. Amateur sleuths combed through surveillance footage, even analyzing timestamps frame by frame, looking for inconsistencies detectives had missed. One thread went viral claiming Angela had been seen in the background of a YouTube video filmed at a state fair 6 months after her disappearance. The woman did bear a resemblance, but the fair was in Oklahoma, and the original video uploader confirmed the date. The woman was later identified. Not Angela. A former pharmacy customer came forward saying Angela had once mentioned a man who made her uncomfortable. A regular customer who lingered too long at the checkout asked personal questions. Police tracked the man down. He'd moved to Indiana. They interviewed him, collected a DNA sample. No match. He had never even interacted with her that day. Another false lead. Mark hired a private investigator with money from a crowdfunding campaign. The man worked tirelessly for nearly a year, retracing the steps police had taken, conducting his own interviews, pursuing his own theories. He eventually turned his focus to the pharmacy's maintenance staff. One janitor had abruptly quit just 3 days after Angela's disappearance. That stood out. Investigators followed the tip. The man had relocated to a town in Missouri. When contacted, he explained the timing. His wife had gone into early labor. They provided medical records, hospital logs, and travel receipts. Another trail that looked promising until it wasn't. With every theory that fizzled out, trust in the system eroded. The Brierly family started to avoid press. Riley, now 8, no longer remembered the sound of his mother's voice. Evan, 15, refused to talk about her at all. Mark started drinking more. The porch light stayed on, but the hope behind it dimmed. He still answered every call, still opened the door every time a car slowed near their driveway, but the optimism had been replaced by something else. A quiet waiting. Detectives rotated off the case. 2 of the original investigators had since retired. The lead was reassigned. The new team reopened some old theories. Maybe it was someone she knew after all. Maybe it was connected to someone in her past. But without new evidence, they were recycling what had already been exhausted. Theories circled like vultures. Abduction, voluntary disappearance, trafficking, even suicide. All plausible in isolation, none definitive. Each one competing with the next, drowning out any chance of focus. By year 2, the folder marked Brierly Angela sat deeper in the cold case archive. No DNA matches, no phone pings, no financial activity, just an ordinary errand, a vanishing point, and an endless flood of noise that led nowhere. And yet, for her family, one truth remained louder than all the rest. Angela had not chosen this silence. Someone had taken her from it. And one day, that silence would crack. By the 5th anniversary of Angela Brierly's disappearance, the town of Huron Ridge had moved on in the way towns do. New families had moved into old houses, local businesses had changed names, and the pharmacy, once the center of the investigation, had completed renovations and now had high-resolution cameras at every exit. The security upgrade was a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened there, even if no one said it out loud anymore. But for Angela's family, the passage of time hadn't brought peace. It had brought silence, a cold, hollow silence that had settled over their lives like a second skin. The official notice came on a Monday morning in early October. A letter from the county sheriff's department stating that due to the absence of new leads, forensic breakthroughs, or actionable intelligence, the investigation into Angela's disappearance would be reclassified as inactive. Not closed, but cold, boxed and archived. The lead detective had retired 6 months earlier. His replacement had called Mark once, asked if there was anything he believed had been missed, then never followed up. The new detective was polite but distant. He had 15 other open cases and limited bandwidth. It wasn't personal, but it felt like a betrayal anyway. The evidence boxes were transferred to storage. Angela's car had long since been returned to Mark. It sat in the garage under a tarp. He hadn't sold it, hadn't driven it, hadn't moved anything inside. Her sunglasses were still in the center console. A crumpled gum wrapper she'd tossed into the cup holder was still there. The air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror had lost its scent years ago, but he refused to take it down. It was the last place she'd touched, and no one had ever figured out who drove it away and left it behind a vacant building. No one ever found the keys. The media had stopped calling entirely. The posters had peeled from telephone poles and bulletin boards. The candlelight vigils became smaller each year. The first anniversary had drawn nearly 200 people. By the 5th, it was just Mark, the kids, Angela's sister, and a few quiet neighbors who didn't know what to say anymore but still showed up. They lit candles outside the pharmacy's rear entrance, the last place anyone could say she'd physically existed. They stood in silence for 10 minutes. No speeches, no press, just absence. Riley was 11 now. He didn't remember much about his mother beyond a few fragmented images, the way she used to brush his hair, the way she hummed while folding laundry, the scent of her lotion when she kissed him goodnight. Most of what he knew had been preserved through photographs and the stories his dad told him when he asked. He didn't ask often. Evan was 17 and had stopped talking about her completely. He refused counseling, stopped attending the vigils, told his father that he needed to live in the present, not in a moment frozen in time. But Mark knew better. Evan had started sleeping with the door locked and a baseball bat under his bed. He hadn't forgotten, he just couldn't let himself remember. Holidays became quieter. Birthdays passed without cakes. Christmas gifts were wrapped with less care. Angela's birthday was the hardest. Every March 16th, Mark would drive to the edge of town and sit in his car, parked near the place her car had been found. He never told anyone why. He just did it. He said it helped him remember that there were still questions no one had answered, and that maybe someone still could. The internet never let the case fully die. Reddit threads popped up occasionally. Amateur investigators continued to spin theories, some grounded in logic, others drifting into conspiracy. One post claimed a serial abductor had used pharmacy locations across 3 states as hunting grounds. Another insisted Angela had discovered something illegal at her workplace and had been silenced. None of it came with evidence, but the theories floated just enough to keep Angela's name from disappearing completely, just enough to keep hope from drying up entirely. Mark had created a file of his own over the years, separate from the police archive, dozens of pages, handwritten notes, maps, receipts, printed emails. He had cross-referenced vehicle sightings, employee shift logs, pharmacy deliveries. He believed someone knew something. Maybe someone who had passed through Huron Ridge that morning, maybe someone who still lived there. But the noise had long since drowned out the signal, and he didn't know where to dig anymore. There were moments when he considered giving up, selling the house, moving states, starting over, but he couldn't. Angela's fingerprints were still on the bathroom mirror, faint but visible when the glass fogged up. Her voice still lived in an old voicemail he had refused to delete, even though the cell provider warned him it would be removed in their next system update. He played it once a month, just to hear her say his name. Year 5 marked more than just time. It marked a shift. The investigators had gone silent. The community had stopped asking questions, but the ache didn't fade. It just changed shape, became quieter, sharper, a persistent void with no edge to hold on to. And then, 5 years and 2 months after she disappeared, a storage facility on the north side of town flagged a delinquent payment. A unit registered under a name no one recognized was about to be auctioned. It had been rented shortly after Angela vanished and never accessed again. The facility manager followed protocol. He opened the unit to prepare for inventory. Inside, beneath stacked boxes and broken furniture, he found something that made him stop, something that didn't belong. He called the police, and just like that, the silence cracked. In September of 2023, exactly 13 years after Angela Brierly stepped into a pharmacy and vanished, a routine administrative task at a self-storage facility just outside Huron Ridge triggered something no one expected. The unit in question had been rented under the name Lyle Brenner, a name that had never come up in the original investigation. The account had been inactive for years, paid via auto withdrawal from a now-depleted bank account. But when the payment finally bounced and no one answered the listed phone number, the facility followed protocol. A 30-day notice was posted. When that expired, the contents of Unit 317 were scheduled for public auction. On the day of the auction, only 2 bidders showed up. Both were local junk pickers, more interested in reselling furniture than solving mysteries. The unit's door creaked open to reveal what looked like someone's forgotten workshed: metal shelving units, several cracked plastic tubs, paint-stained tarps, a push broom, and broken pieces of drywall. There were old pharmacy boxes labeled "Retail Returns" and several unopened bottles of expired cleaning agents. Nothing valuable. But one of the bidders noticed something strange. Why was one corner of the unit blocked off with stacked furniture positioned like a wall? A filing cabinet was pressed up against a plywood desk, wedged so tightly that it looked intentional. Behind it, a mattress frame leaned vertically, like a barrier. That bidder didn't win the auction. But he mentioned the odd arrangement to the facility manager, who decided to take a second look. When staff cleared the barricade, they found something deeply out of place. An interior plywood panel mounted to the concrete wall, not part of the original structure. When they pulled it free, what lay behind it stopped them cold. The hidden space was narrow, less than 4 feet wide, maybe 8 feet deep. At first glance, it looked like storage overflow. But tucked into the farthest corner, they found a small blue duffel bag covered in dust, sealed shut. Inside were personal effects: a cracked cell phone, a worn-down tube of lipstick, a key ring with a faded pharmacy loyalty tag still attached, an envelope containing several family photos, and a prescription bottle with Angela Brierly's name on it. The date matched the one she picked up the day she vanished. The handwriting on the label had faded, but it was hers. The unit was immediately sealed and law enforcement contacted. The news didn't break publicly for 2 weeks. Police wanted time to verify what they had before unleashing the media storm they knew would follow. Forensics arrived within hours. They processed the unit in full hazmat suits, documenting every square inch. A partial fingerprint was recovered from the inside zipper of the duffel bag. DNA was pulled from a hair strand found inside one of the coats stored in the corner. The cell phone was too degraded to boot, but data was extracted. The SIM card had not been removed. Records traced the storage unit's rental to a man named Kyle Renner, a former part-time maintenance contractor for the pharmacy in 2010. He had worked under a subcontractor's license and had no direct employment records with the store itself. Only one technician remembered him, vaguely. His name had never made it into the original suspect pool. Kyle had moved out of state less than 6 months after Angela disappeared. No criminal record, no red flags. A quiet life, now living in upstate New York under a slightly altered version of his name, K.L. Renner. Detectives moved quickly. A warrant was issued and Renner was brought in for questioning. He denied everything, claimed he had no memory of Angela, no idea how her belongings could have ended up in a storage unit rented in his name. Said he'd been paying for several storage spaces over the years and had forgotten about some of them. The signature on the lease matched his. The bank account used to pay was his. He couldn't explain it. He also refused to take a polygraph. The fingerprint came back inconclusive, too smudged. The DNA pulled from the coat was not a match to Renner, but it wasn't Angela's either. It belonged to an unknown male, still unlinked in CODIS. That meant no direct physical evidence tying Renner to a crime. Not yet. But the presence of Angela's personal effects, especially the phone, the photos, and the prescription bottle, was enough to reopen the case in full. News leaked to the press shortly after Renner's name became public. For the first time in over a decade, Angela's photo appeared again on national television. Her children, now adults, gave brief statements through a family friend. They didn't speak to the media directly. Mark Brierly, thinner now, older and visibly drained, stood outside the Huron Ridge Police Department and addressed reporters with a quiet voice. He said he wasn't interested in closure. He wanted truth and accountability. The unit itself became the focal point of the investigation. What wasn't found was just as chilling as what was. No human remains, no clothing fibers indicating a violent act, no blood. But the items were deliberate, preserved, hidden. Someone had taken the time to collect pieces of Angela's life, stash them, and build a false wall to keep them secret. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was concealment. And buried beneath a stack of pharmacy crates, investigators found one final item, a compact mirror engraved with Angela's initials. Inside, wedged behind the glass, was a folded receipt, dated the day before her disappearance. The address printed on it matched a hardware store in town. The item purchased, a set of screws, a hammer, and a single sheet of plywood. And suddenly, the silence of 13 years wasn't quiet anymore. It was starting to speak. Inside Unit 317, once the plywood panel was removed, investigators found what they initially thought was just an insulated recess, a shallow alcove in the concrete back wall. But as they examined further, they realized this wasn't part of the unit's original structure. The seams were too clean, the insulation too carefully installed. A layer of drywall had been mounted to frame out a compartment behind a fake wall, sealed with construction-grade adhesive and weather stripping, designed not just to hide, but to preserve. It had remained untouched for over a decade, and when forensic teams carefully cut through the final layer, they found something far more deliberate than anyone expected. The space was small, just over 2 feet deep, barely enough room for a person to crouch. There was no light source, no ventilation, but it had been lined with carpet remnants and insulated foam. In the back corner, items had been placed, not shoved, not tossed, but arranged. A plastic Ziploc bag containing 2 photographs, a leather wallet, a faded notepad with grocery scribbles, a tube of lip balm, 1 sneaker, size 7, and wedged underneath, nearly flattened from years of pressure, was a folded receipt matching the exact timestamp from Angela's pharmacy pickup 13 years earlier. Further in, forensic techs discovered a torn section of clothing, a navy hoodie sleeve with a faint grease mark along the cuff. The garment matched the outfit Angela had last been seen wearing on surveillance footage. No blood, no clear trauma, but the fibers were consistent with her DNA profile. Another bag contained what looked like employee paperwork, documents referencing shift schedules, some dated just days before her disappearance. Each had water damage along the edges, but the ink was still partially legible. One name appeared multiple times: Kyle L. Renner. Investigators already had Renner's connection from the unit lease. Now they had a deeper thread: employment documents placing him at the pharmacy during the same weeks Angela worked there part-time as a volunteer outreach coordinator for their seasonal fundraiser. She wasn't technically a co-worker, but their paths would have crossed. Renner had handled after-hours cleanup, backdoor access, and minor maintenance jobs. He would have known the building's blind spots. He would have had unsupervised access to delivery routes, exit schedules, and likely learned when security systems were down for updates. All things that, in hindsight, felt glaring. But in 2010, none of it had raised a red flag. He was a contractor. Background check cleared. He finished his work and left quietly. The discovery of the hidden chamber changed everything. The entire tone of the investigation shifted from circumstantial to personal. This wasn't a random storage locker someone forgot to empty. This was a constructed space, built to conceal, organized to retain trace evidence, and sealed to last. The placement of the items was methodical. The photographs showed Angela and her kids, clearly pulled from her wallet. One had been creased and flattened as though folded and opened repeatedly. The receipt, the notepad, even the half-empty lip balm all pointed to someone who didn't just want to hide her things, but preserve them. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a crime scene. And yet, there were still no remains, no confession, no surveillance footage ever showing her leaving the building. But the forensic weight of the chamber, combined with Renner's name on the employment logs and the storage lease, put him at the center of the case. When authorities re-questioned Renner, now under legal counsel, he refused to speak. His lawyer cited the lack of direct forensic evidence, no fingerprints on the interior chamber, no DNA linking him to the clothing. And, technically, the documents with his name could have been planted. The items could have been stored there by anyone with access. The chamber didn't prove who built it, not definitively. Investigators disagreed. The construction was too deliberate, the layout too intimate. One detective described it as a personalized vault for someone's guilt. But without a body, a weapon, or an eyewitness, they had to be careful. Renner remained a person of interest, but was not arrested. He was released after 8 hours of questioning. Surveillance was quietly placed on him in New York, while a new team reviewed everything from scratch, including hundreds of pieces of unused evidence from the original investigation. Angela's family was notified of the discovery before it became public. Mark flew to Ohio the next day. He was allowed to view the photographs under supervision, but not touch them. He identified the notepad as hers, said it was from the fridge, said the handwriting, though shaky, was without a doubt Angela's. When he saw the sneaker, he had to leave the room. For the first time in 13 years, the Brierly family had proof that Angela didn't run. She hadn't chosen to vanish. She'd been taken, and someone had hidden pieces of her life away like trophies. The chamber wasn't an accident, it was an artifact of control, and whoever built it hadn't expected anyone to find it, especially not this many years later. But now it was open, and the secrets it held had just started unraveling. When the unit's lease and hidden chamber pointed to Kyle L. Renner, investigators began a deep reconstruction of his life in 2010. At first glance, he appeared clean. No prior convictions, no complaints filed with the pharmacy, no known ties to Angela. But digging past surface-level records revealed something different. His full name was Kyle Lawrence Renner. In the summer of 2003, he'd been arrested in Missouri for aggravated assault during a domestic disturbance. The charges were dropped after the victim recanted, but the police report described controlling behavior, obsessive attachment, and physical intimidation. It wasn't enough to put him on a registry, but it was enough to raise flags. And it had never come up in the original background check. Because at the time of his pharmacy employment, Renner was working under a shortened version of his name, Kyle L. Renner, and that one missing detail had kept him beneath the radar. The pharmacy confirmed he worked odd hours, late shifts, early prep, janitorial tasks that didn't require supervision. He had access to the employee break room, the storage areas, the dumpsters, and the back entrance where Angela had last been seen on camera. He'd been present the day she vanished, but no one had flagged him. He clocked in before opening and left before lunch. There had been no indication at the time that he had seen or spoken to Angela that morning. He was considered background noise in a loud room. When detectives pieced together the schedule logs from that week, something else surfaced. On the morning Angela disappeared, Renner had signed off on a facilities checklist, noting a rear door latch misalignment. Maintenance had been dispatched the day prior, and Renner was instructed to keep an eye on it. He logged the status at 10:06 a.m., nearly 20 minutes after Angela vanished from the pharmacy's front-facing cameras. In his report, he marked it functioning, repaired. But surveillance footage from outside never captured him exiting or re-entering the building during that window. The only exit not covered by cameras? The rear utility door, the one the original security system had left blind due to renovations. Investigators mapped his movements in the weeks after Angela's disappearance. Renner stopped showing up to work 3 days later. He didn't formally resign. He never picked up his final paycheck. According to his landlord, he left the basement apartment he was renting without notice, leaving behind a few pieces of broken furniture and a mattress. No forwarding address. His listed phone number was disconnected within a week. He simply disappeared from Huron Ridge. By December of that year, he reappeared in upstate New York under a slightly different name, K. Lawrence Renner. He worked for another janitorial subcontractor, this time servicing office parks. No criminal activity, no red flags, no incidents reported. He stayed in that position for nearly a decade, but he never returned to Ohio. He never contacted former coworkers, and he never updated any public profiles, employment histories, or tax records tying him back to Huron Ridge after 2010. That silence, in hindsight, looked less like coincidence and more like deliberate separation. With the discovery in the storage unit, police now had enough to bring him in again, this time under active suspicion. They cross-referenced his past addresses with traffic camera logs, utility payments, and storage facilities in nearby counties. What they found was quietly chilling. 2 additional units had been registered to him in the years following Angela's disappearance. One in Indiana, another in northern Pennsylvania. Both had been closed in 2015 and 2017, respectively. Their contents had never been auctioned. He'd cleared them himself. Whatever was inside, it was gone. Still, authorities now believed he had engaged in a pattern of behavior, renting remote storage units under different names, possibly using them to hide personal belongings or evidence of contact with Angela. The unit in Ohio had simply slipped through the cracks because of the auto pay setup. It had been the one he forgot to close. The prosecution team knew what they were up against. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, no direct DNA tying Renner to Angela. But the circumstantial weight was growing. He was present, he had access, he vanished immediately after. And 13 years later, evidence tied to Angela's last known day was found in a unit under his name. Police secured a warrant to search his current home. They collected electronic devices, paperwork, hard drives. In a locked cabinet, they found a series of handwritten journals. Most were mundane, work complaints, sketches, lists. But one contained a single page, folded and refolded until the edges had torn. It wasn't signed. It didn't mention Angela by name. But it read, "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to talk. She was scared. I tried to make it okay. I built a place. I kept her safe. But she wouldn't stop crying. I panicked. It wasn't a confession, not legally. There was no context, no date, but it was enough to keep him from walking away again." Renner was taken into custody for questioning. He invoked his right to remain silent. The journal was sent for handwriting analysis. Forensics confirmed it matched previous entries in his own notebooks, but still, no body, no recorded confession, and no confirmed cause of death. The DA's office debated whether to pursue charges or continue gathering evidence. In the eyes of Angela's family, there was no more mystery. They believed Kyle Renner had taken her, hidden her, and erased her from their lives. But the law needed more than belief. It needed proof. And unless that proof turned up soon, the man they saw as her abductor might walk free. What no one knew, not then, was that the next clue had already been found. It was just waiting to be understood. 13 years is a long time to wait for evidence. It's even longer for evidence to survive. As forensic teams pored over the items found inside the hidden chamber, Angela's personal effects, the clothing, the handwritten note, they were confronted with a frustrating reality. Time had not been kind to the material. The DNA found on the hoodie sleeve was degraded. The cell phone had been exposed to humidity and heat cycles that corrupted most of the internal memory. The fingerprint lifted from the bag zipper was partial, incomplete, and too worn to match confidently in court. The handwriting sample, while consistent with Kyle Renner's known journals, lacked a signature or any direct mention of Angela's name. Prosecutors debated for weeks whether the items could stand up to legal scrutiny, knowing the defense would seize on every hole in the chain of custody, every grain of doubt introduced by years of slow decay. Witnesses posed another problem. Former pharmacy employees had moved away, forgotten details, or simply refused to get involved. One employee, now retired, recalled seeing Renner near the back hallway that morning, but couldn't say with certainty whether it had been before or after Angela arrived. Another remembered Renner being quiet, socially awkward, and once commenting on Angela's friendliness, but again, nothing that crossed a legal threshold. The circumstantial weight was heavy, but circumstantial evidence alone was fragile in front of a jury. The district attorney's office had internal disagreements. The lead prosecutor believed they had enough for an arrest, maybe even a trial. But without a body, without DNA, definitively placing Renner inside that chamber, there was risk. A failed prosecution could mean no second chance. Meanwhile, Mark and the children, adults now, were asked to prepare themselves for both possibilities, a courtroom or another silence. And with every new delay, every legal memo weighed and filed, the same fear returned to the family's doorstep, that this could all vanish again, and the last 13 years might amount to nothing more than a reopened wound. But just as momentum began to stall, a forensic tech, reviewing old data pulled from the broken phone, flagged a string of code buried in the corrupted drive. It wasn't a photo or message. It was a location pin, a GPS coordinate from 13 years ago. One last signal sent the morning Angela disappeared. It was stored in a cached app, frozen in time, never overwritten. And it didn't match the location of the pharmacy or the car. It was somewhere else entirely, a wooded property on the edge of town, privately owned, never searched, and suddenly the case that had gone quiet for over a decade was no longer just about memories. It had a new direction, a location, a chance, and what they would find there would either end the mystery or bury it even deeper. The wooded lot marked by the phone's last location was quiet, overgrown, and bordered by rusted fencing. It had once been the back acreage of a house Renner rented briefly during the fall of 2010. Records showed he'd only lived there for 2 months after Angela's disappearance. No search had ever been conducted. It wasn't part of the original investigation. The land had changed hands since, but the property remained largely untouched. With a new warrant in hand, law enforcement brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic teams. Just beyond the tree line, near an old fire pit and beneath a collapsed section of fencing, they found what they were looking for. Shallow, partial, not complete remains, but bone fragments, clothing fibers, and material that matched the hoodie Angela had been wearing the day she vanished. DNA later confirmed the fragments belonged to her. There was no skull, no hands, no cause of death could be determined. But in the eyes of investigators, the case had shifted from disappearance to homicide. Angela had never walked away. She hadn't gone missing. She had been taken, hidden, and buried. Kyle Renner was arrested at his home in upstate New York and brought back to Ohio under sealed indictment. But before a trial date could be set, before even a grand jury could hear the full case, Renner suffered a massive stroke while in custody. He was declared medically incapacitated. 3 days later, he died in a hospital bed, under guard, having never spoken a word about what happened that day. No confession, no explanation, just silence. Angela's family was told quietly, behind closed doors. There would be no trial, no courtroom cross-examinations, no formal reading of charges, just a sealed box of evidence, a location on a map, and remains too incomplete to bury properly. What had begun as a routine errand all those years ago had ended in uncertainty, wrapped in a kind of awful clarity. She hadn't left the pharmacy alive. But how she died, why she was taken, and what was done in the hours that followed, those answers were gone with him. The official case file was updated and closed. Mark, now older and grayer, carried the news with the same quiet he'd carried everything else. He held no press conference. Angela's name didn't trend. The media had moved on years ago, but at home, her photo was finally placed beside a small memorial, this time with a date etched next to her name. No longer missing. Just gone. 13 years later, the story returned to where it began, with a woman stepping out to run an errand and never coming home. The truth had surfaced, but justice never had. And in the end, it wasn't a trial that closed the case. It was time. Time that erased witnesses, time that decayed evidence, time that allowed the silence to grow so loud even the answers felt hollow.